Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Gargi Chaturvedi, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. It is a matter of great pleasure to extend a warm welcome to all to another edition of the ICS's Wednesday seminar titled Tibet, the Neighbour India Lost. Today's seminar is based on Ambassador Sinha's recent publication titled Imperial Games in Tibet, the Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty. The book investigates how British, Russian, and Chinese imperial policies reshaped India's northern border, transforming the region from a peaceful one into a huge security concern for India. The author draws from British archival materials and a corpus of contemporary writings to uncover details about Anglo-Russian agreements on Tibet and Central Asia, contrasts Tibet and East Turkestan with Mongolia. The book also critiques China's narratives of the century of humiliation in the light of assistance it received from Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. The author traces the historical backdrop of the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907, which legitimized Chinese sovereignty, and scrutinizes Britain's difficulties in upholding its provisions after the collapse of the Manchu dynasty. While also reflecting upon Tibetan resistance to China's claims, the challenges ahead for the Tibetan people, as well as its implications for India. The speaker for today's seminar is Ambassador Dilip Sinha. He is a writer and a former diplomat. As a career diplomat, he has served at various diplomatic positions in different countries and international organizations. He has worked in the Prime Minister's office during the term of Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao and was also the chairman of the Manipur Public Service Commission. Ambassador Sinha has authored two books, namely Legitimacy of Power, The Permanence of Five in the Security Council, and Imperial Games in Tibet, The Struggle for Statehood and Sovereignty, published in 2018 and 2024, respectively. The chair for today's seminar is Dr. Sonika Gupta. She is an associate professor of global politics at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, Institute of Technology, Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. Her research interests include the Tibetan exile community in India and cosmopolitanism and international relations theory. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may also use the raise hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Dr. Gupta. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be hosting this, chairing this event, because this is an area that is very close to my research, and I really look forward to hearing much more about it from Ambassador Sinha. This is, as we were just told, this is Imperial Games is Ambassador Sinha's second book. And this book explores Tibet's political trajectory in search of statehood and sovereignty. This is a long-standing question, which Sering Shakya, who is the foremost historian of Tibet today, he has also explored as to why Tibet did not gain statehood as the Great Game wound down in the Himalayas, whereas Mongolia and Bhutan, the other two landlocked states, and also Tibet's neighbors, also practicing Tibetan Buddhism, did succeed as sovereign states as the wave of decolonization unfolded here. Very interestingly, Ambassador Sinha focuses his inquiry on the role of China as an imperial power in the Great Game. Now, this allows us to re-examine the long-standing Chinese narrative of victimhood during what is known as the century of humiliation for China. This inquiry also points to a very complex nature of geopolitics from the Opium Wars till the mid-1950s at least, which is the period during which the question of Tibet's statehood and sovereignty becomes vital. This complex geopolitics consists of the Chinese state being simultaneously subject to forces of Western imperialism, while at the same time, it was pursuing its own imperial project in Tibet, Xinjiang, and Mongolia. And I must say here that Ambassador Sinha's book is an exciting new addition to the Indian diplomatic writing on Tibet and China that has really enriched scholarship on this area of foreign policy in the past decade. And this particularly diplomatic scholarship allows researchers and lay readers an insight into the workings of foreign policy and geopolitics on India's Himalayan borders. So looking forward to a very enriching discussion on this important book to help us all understand Tibet better. Ambassador Sinha, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Gupta. It's a great honor for me to be invited by the Institute of Chinese Studies to speak on this subject. Talking to such an informed audience is a daunting task. And I have been invited to speak about Tibet, the neighbor that India lost. And my claim to speak on this subject, as you've just mentioned, comes from my book, Imperial Games in Tibet, released last month. And my talk will revolve around it. I realize that I am talking to experts in the field, so I'll be brief and focus on my key findings. I will also identify some of the questions that I think deserve further in-depth examination by scholars in ICS. The two key questions I have examined in the book are: why did Tibet fail to assert its claim to statehood strongly enough for the question to be put on the international agenda? And why is China's claim to Tibet gone so unchallenged? Then comes the inevitable corollary: should India be concerned about Tibet? So looking at the first question about Tibet's claim to statehood, Tibet itself has often described its relations with China as between priest and patron. Now, this is a religious relationship expressed in religious terminology, which does not fit in any international law construct of statehood. But this was back in the Manchu period, when Tibetan lamas were patronized by Qing rulers. Qing means the Manchu dynasty. After the fall of the Qing dynasty, the 13th Dalai Lama declared independence. He signed a treaty of mutual support with Mongolia and even fought some border skirmishes with China, which required British mediation. Tibet remained neutral in both the world wars. And the fact that China had to send an army to liberate in quotes in 1950 affirms that Tibet was not under its control at that time. Now, when China invaded Tibet, the young 14th Dalai Lama appealed to the international community for help. No one came forward, and he accepted Chinese rule on the assurance given by China, as signed in that May 1951 agreement, that Tibet's autonomy and religious institutions would be respected. Later, when the Dalai Lama fled to India because of Chinese atrocities, he once again asked India for support in asserting Tibet's independence. And it was only when he found that there was no hope of any such support coming from any quarter that he reconciled himself to seeking a compromise solution to his country's status. Now, what about China's claim to Tibet? No country contests it, as we all know, and it is accepted as gospel truth. But when exactly did Tibet become a part of China? Chinese historians themselves differ wildly on this. Some say it became a part in the Manchu period. Some go back to the Mongols. Now, China has pushed the date back to ancient times. China also insists that Tibetan language belongs to the Sino-Tibetan family, and Buddhism went there from China. Now, the historical fact is that since ancient times, India's relations with Tibet have always been much closer than China's. The Tibetan language is closely linked with languages of Sikkim and Bhutan, and its script went from India, as did the Buddhist religion. Now, these are all issues that need to be examined critically by Indian scholars. They must counter Chinese disinformation to protect both the history and identity of the Tibetan people and the close relations that have existed between our two countries. China can rewrite its history as many times as it wants, but it can't be allowed to change ours, Tibet's. If India does not step up the study of Tibetan history and culture, other countries will fill the vacuum. Tibetan refugees are already moving out of India in droves. The city with the largest number of Tibetans is now New York. We cannot let the initiative slip to countries like the US, which in its recent law on Tibet calls upon the government to counter China's disinformation on Tibet. For other countries, Tibet is merely a geopolitical card. For India, it is an ancient neighbor whose security is as important as our own. India's relations with Tibet have always been friendly, and their border rarely raised security concerns for either country. Even under the Manchus, the border was left largely, in fact, entirely unguarded. There used to be a small Manchu contingent for the personal security of the Amban. These troops were not there for Tibet's defense. Now, when China invaded Tibet in 1950, India did everything possible to appease it. India did not give any military or diplomatic help to Tibet. It helped the Chinese General Chiang Ching-wu travel to Lhasa through India. It sent food supplies for the occupation army, converted its diplomatic mission, which had opened in 1936, into a consulate, and signed the Panchsheel Agreement recognizing Tibet as a part of China. India never made an issue of China's repressive policies in Tibet. But India could not wish away Tibet. When China started its crackdown in Tibet, the Dalai Lama and several thousand Tibetans sought shelter in India, and India fulfilled its responsibility as a good neighbor. But in the process, it incurred China's wrath. 3 years later, China inflicted a humiliating military defeat on India. Now I come to the second question. Why did the world accept China's claim to Tibet so easily? This is the central theme of my book. I have looked at archival material and contemporary writings to understand the games played by the three main imperial powers seeking control over Central Asia: China, Russia, and Britain. China was the first of the empires. Actually, it was Manchu China. The Manchus had conquered China in 1644, and then, as part of their policy to check the Mongols and control the Mongols, it went into Central Asia. As did the Russians. The Russians also came to Central Asia primarily to control the Mongols, because the Genghis Khan's empire had crossed all across Asia to Russia. So the fear of the Mongols worried both people in China and the people in Russia. And China was the first of the empires to expand into Central Asia. It did so in the 18th century when it conquered Tibet and East Turkestan. I call it East Turkestan and not Xinjiang, which is the name that China uses for this region. But times I might say Xinjiang possibly out of error. By the middle of the 19th century, that is about 100 years later, the Chinese empire had gone into decline. Britain and Russia had by now entered the scene, and they were carving out regions between them. But the records reveal that despite China's weakness, it played its cards extremely well and succeeded in holding on to its empire. So let me elaborate on this a little bit. Now, there are some astounding facts of China's history in this period that both China and Britain downplay. China's decline had started soon after the First Opium War, which ended in 1842. The defeat of the Manchus destroyed the myth of the invincibility, of their invincibility, and there was an uprising in the Han-dominated southern China. China was racked by a brutal civil war called the Taiping Rebellion, in which the Han Chinese in the south were pitted against the Manchu north. Then, soon thereafter, came the Second Opium War in 1860, in which Britain and France found themselves in control of Beijing. The Manchu Emperor had fled north to Manchuria, his hometown, his home place, where he died. But Britain, which had the Chinese Empire at its feet, did not overthrow the Qing dynasty, nor did it annex the country, as it had done just a few years earlier in India. Remember, in 18% there was a revolt in India. And the British came back, crushed the revolt, and took over the entire kingdom and annexing the British Empire, but it did not do so in the case of Beijing. And again, I've gone into great details as to why it didn't happen. Instead, the European powers came to China's rescue by helping it maintain its unity and restore its empire. Now, this is the period that China calls the century of humiliation, from the First Opium War ending in 1842 to 1949 when the communists came to power, because of the exploitation done by the European powers. But China ignores the help it received from Europeans in this difficult period. But the question arises, why did Britain help China in the first place? And this is because the country that had established relations with China well before West Europeans came to China was Russia. And when the British and French troops reached Beijing in 1860, the Russian Empire was already ensconced there. And one of the advice he gave to the British general, Lord Elgin, was, do not stay here during winter because the rivers will freeze and your withdrawal, your retreat to Tianjin will be cut off and you'll be massacred here by the Mongols and Manchus when they come down in the winter. So before the rivers froze, Lord Elgin came back to Tianjin, which was the sea coast, because Britain, being a naval power, felt much safer near the coast than deep in the interior of the country. So this rivalry with Russia explains Britain's reluctance to try and to break up the Chinese empire, because Britain realized that if the Manchu Empire collapsed, then Russia, being the closest, would grab the lion's share. After the Opium War, Britain started helping the Manchus suppress the rebellion, the Taiping Rebellion, and reconquer their disintegrating empire. Now, here's some very interesting facts. British Army and Navy officers were allowed to serve in Manchu China, and British law was amended for this purpose because there was a law prohibiting British officers from serving in a foreign country. And people like Charles Gordon, who was called the Chinese Gordon, was a commander in the British Army. He trained, Manchu Army. He trained the Chinese Army. And Horatio Lay can be called the founder of Chinese Navy because he got ships built in Britain and delivered here, and British officers commanded these ships. Robert Hart was an administrator, and he set up China's customs office, because one of the things that the Europeans wanted was to extract money from the Chinese. Now, the coffers were empty. So they said, okay, you will give us a share of the customs duty. And to enable China to pay, they said, we'll reorganize the customs duty for you, customs office for you. And Robert Hart was the head of the Chinese customs office till 1908, when he was rewarded and he retired. And the customs office continued to be under a Western person. The last person was an American who fled to Taiwan along with Chiang Kai-shek. So from the 1860s, you find that the Chinese customs office was organized by Europeans, primarily by the British. Then came Britain helped, of course, the Manchus in suppressing the Taiping Rebellion. Then Britain helped China reconquer East Turkestan. And then it encouraged the southern frontier of the border of Ladakh to be drawn up in such a way that China came and filled up the gap between the Kunlun Mountains and the Karakoram Mountains, where there was no Chinese presence earlier. And in fact, when the British asked the Chinese to come and fill up this area, the Chinese Foreign Office told them that this area doesn't belong to us. But Britain was very scared that the Russians would come in, and they practically compelled the Chinese to come down south to the Karakoram Pass when the Chinese first came and built a pillar on the Karakoram Pass in 1892. So these are the various ways in which the invasion of East Turkestan was done by a Chinese army. But guess who financed it? The Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank Corporation, HSBC today. And it was their finance that enabled the Manchus to reconquer East Turkestan. Now, I jump now to the time when the Qing dynasty collapsed in 1912, and Tibet declared independence a year later, 1913. When this happened, Britain got worried again, because an independent Tibet to them was anathema, because in the imperial thinking of that time, any independent country was free game for an imperial power. So they were always scared that the Russians would come in. So when Tibet declared independence in 1913, Britain immediately called a representative from China, and China had two governments at that time, the North and the South, because the Chinese Revolution had broken out there, the communist, Sun Yat-sen's revolution. And Britain recognized the government in Beijing of Yuan Shikai just 1 week before inviting the representative to come to Shimla for talks. And the purpose of the talks in Shimla was to get Tibet and China to come to some kind of an agreement so that they would not fight each other. The Borders Commission had started by that time. And to ensure that Chinese suzerainty over Tibet was kept intact so that Russia would not come in, while at the same time realizing that China had no capacity to help Tibet at that time, the British would ensure that Tibet was able to at least maintain its governance and its trade with India. So the agreement of 1907 that you mentioned about, the Anglo-Russian agreement, came into play here, and that was upheld in these agreements. Now, again, I'll jump. Now, I say it's one of the harshest ironies of history that those countries of Central Asia, which were taken by Russia and annexed in the Russian Empire, or which were in this part of the world ruled by the British, became independent when these two empires collapsed. But the Chinese Empire, which was the first of the three empires to collapse in 1912, recovered its empire when the Communist Party came to power, and when it reconquered East Turkestan and Tibet, Britain and Russia honored their old deals and did not question China's annexations. So we come now to India's policy after independence. India, as you know, continued Britain's policy. There is some confusion here because we keep thinking of Lord Curzon and his policy of attacking Tibet and forcing a treaty on Tibet. But we must remember that Lord Curzon was an aberration. Lord Curzon's treaty was not accepted by London, and young husband was actually denounced for his invasion for violating London's instructions on invading Tibet. And soon after the treaty was signed by young husband in Lhasa in 1904, 2 years later, the British got a Chinese representative to come down to Delhi, to Calcutta, and there another agreement was signed in which the agreement signed by Curzon was put as an annex with certain key amendments, so that treaty of 1904 is no longer a self-standing treaty. So during this period, that is after Tibet declared independence, Britain did maintain commercial and diplomatic presence in Tibet. Incidentally, one of the things that the 1907 agreement had was a provision was that Britain would not open a mission in Lhasa. They could have 3 trade marts, but not a mission in Lhasa. Ultimately, Britain opened a mission in Lhasa only in 1936. And this was primarily because by this time, things had become quite difficult in Russia itself. There was this revolution had taken place. So at that time, Britain did, and initially it had the political officer in Sikkim was doubled up as the head of the Indian mission in Lhasa. So Britain was very careful about not offending Russia in showing that it was trying to annex or control Tibet. And in fact, when young husband invaded Tibet, one of the things that you find is a lot of correspondence taking place between Britain and Russia in St. Petersburg, where Britain was trying to explain to Russia that it had no intention of annexing Tibet. And Russia kept protesting. And it was eventually when the 1906 treaty was signed and the 1907 treaty between Britain and Russia that things became a little reassuring for Russia. But then by this time, as I said again, the Imperial Games, Russia had lost to Japan in the 1904 war. So things had changed a little bit for Russia. Now, coming back to India's policy, India's acceptance of Chinese rule over Tibet had grave consequences for India's own security on its northern border. India had only one agreement with China on the border, the agreement of 1890, the Anglo-Chinese agreement defining the Sikkim's border with Tibet. This was in 1890. And all other agreements, in fact, just two other agreements essentially, the 1914 Shimla Agreement and an agreement between the Maharaja of Kashmir and Tibet of 1842. These were with Tibet, between India and Tibet. Now, all these agreements were nullified in one stroke, the agreements between India and Tibet. And since China did not recognize Sikkim as a part of India until much later, even that agreement was not accepted by China as a valid international agreement. So China now questions almost the entire length of India's border with Tibet and has now escalated its claim to Himalayan regions, that is the lower slopes of the Himalayas. And all Indian territory claimed by China is based on its claim to Tibet. Now, then we come to the final part of my presentation, which is Tibet important for India at all? After all, the whole world has accepted its annexation. And apart from expressing concern on China's human rights violations, no country is prepared to do anything about Tibet. Is it better for India to forget Tibet and continue its efforts to improve relations with China? Now, the answer to this lies in the resistance of the Tibetan people. The world may have forgotten Tibet, but its people have not given up. Their resistance continues to infuriate China, provoking it to take harsh repressive measures inside Tibet and treat any country sympathetic to Tibet as an enemy. India remains the prime suspect. So every time there is any Tibetan uprising, either inside Tibet or a demonstration outside Tibet, China suspects India of being behind it. And the continuing confrontation between India and China is a reminder that the border dispute is only a manifestation of the real problem between them, which is Tibet. For other big powers, Tibet is a playground for their geopolitical ambitions. But for India, it defines its biggest security challenge. China's rise as a superpower has revived international interest in Tibet, and a new geopolitical game has started because of the downslide in US-China relations. The US now sees China as a rival and is building alliances against it. It sees Tibet as China's soft underbelly, and the stormy contest of the big powers of the past has resurfaced, and India is once again in the center of it. And we saw that recently when this congressional delegation came and went all the way to Dharamshala to call on the Dalai Lama, which was a US delegation calling on the Dalai Lama on Indian soil. You can understand the implications of it for our relations with China. Whatever policy it adopts, and I have not gone into the policy options available to India in this issue, because that becomes a whole new chapter or a whole new book. But whatever policy India adopts, it must do so in an informed manner. India cannot remain ignorant of Tibet, of the history of India-Tibet relations, and be unprepared for the future. Because unless one understands Tibet's status as a country, its emotions, its ambitions, and its feelings, India will never be able to understand where Tibet stands in its relations with China. And unless it understands that, it will not be able to formulate its policy on Tibet in a reasonably informed manner. So I'll stop here and I'll take questions.
Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. That was a very vast canvas that you covered for us, both historically and brought it up to the contemporary times. And I'm sure there'll be questions regarding both aspects of the Tibetan context that you spoke about, the historical and the contemporary. There are already 2 questions here. And Gargi, would you read them out?
Sure, ma'am. So there are two questions in the chat box as for now. So should I go one by one, or you want me to read both of them together?
Read both together. If they are similar, I might answer them together. If they are separate, we'll take them separately.
Sure. So there's one question from Raj Kumar. In medium to long term, if India increases her comprehensive national power on par with China and right time comes to take over Tibet by Tibetans themselves in India, what would be India's answer to China's most nuclear missiles armed area of Tibetan plateau and re-liberation of Tibet is really possible in long or longer term? The second question is also from Raj Kumar. China doesn't follow most bilateral and multilateral treaties where it doesn't suit her interests. Then will she follow Upper Riparian Treaty or for India and subsequently South Asia, East Asia in case of Satluj and Indus rivers, although leaving Brahmaputra River as most of her catchment area is in Arunachal Pradesh? These are the two questions for you, sir.
Okay, one of the first question, it mentions that if India increases its military strength to a point where it can take on China or match China. Now, that of course presumes that that is possible at some point in the near future. In any case, I don't think India has ever expressed a desire to seek a military solution to the problem of Tibet. China is a nuclear power, even without its nuclear powers, it's a major power. And any possibility of liberating Tibet militarily is certainly at present ruled out. But the peaceful movement of the Tibetan people has to be something that must be taken note of by countries. And that pressure should be maintained, both because it concerns the rights of the people of Tibet, and it concerns the security of our northern borders. So this is an issue that India should take up, at least start making Tibet an international issue, both because of its human rights concerns and because of its desire to seek autonomy or independence or whatever the Tibetan people want to seek. Now here, obviously, China's nuclear power will be a factor. China is not a compromising country. Certainly on Tibet, it is not prepared to even talk to the Central Tibetan administration. It is only prepared to talk to the Dalai Lama as a representative, and that too only on the issue of the Dalai Lama going back and accepting his status as a vassal of China. So that remains a problem to which there are no easy solutions. On the waterfront, one of the reasons why China is very keen to hold on to Tibet, apart from the imperial legacy that it wants to uphold, there are two reasons. One is water resources. Tibet is the third largest water resource in the world, freshwater resource in the world. And Tibet also has, I think, 60% or 70% of China's lithium resources. So Tibet's resources are a major attraction for China. Its claim to the water resources of Tibet affects us directly, because at least three major rivers of India have their origin in Tibet, and China is not prepared to accept any of its international responsibilities as an upper riparian. China has for the last 4 years even stopped sharing hydrological data of the Tsangpo River, the Brahmaputra Tsangpo River. I think Mr. Rajkumar mentioned about the Indus and Satluj. Now, these two rivers are part of the Indus Waters Treaty that India signed with Pakistan. It's one of the most unique treaties where we, as an upper riparian, have signed a treaty with a country with which we have fought several wars. And yet we signed a treaty accepting responsibility to share water with Pakistan. And here is China, which is not prepared to even talk about water sharing. Even though in the case of the Indus Waters Treaty, China is the upper riparian for 2 of the 6 rivers. So we have a very legitimate claim to stating that China should also undertake some commitments for us to be able to implement the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, you're quite right about the Brahmaputra taking most of its water from the sub-Himalayan, from Arunachal Pradesh. But the fact also remains that during the lean season, when the river's flow has to be maintained, the flow from Tibet is important. In any case, as part of the international obligations that countries that all upper riparians have, there should be conversation and dialogue between countries on sharing of river waters. Thanks.
I think Aditya had raised a hand. Aditya Sachin. Aditya, are you there? Okay, while we are trying to connect with Aditya, there is a question by Anurag Khan. Can you read that, Gargi, please?
Sure, ma'am. But above that, there's another question by Mr. Rakesh Chopra.
Okay, fine. Yeah, let's get to that one.
Yeah. So his question is, Ambassador, to you. Knowledge on the subject is meager. What should we do? Why do you rule out a military solution?
Why do I rule out a military solution? India itself fought for its independence through non-violence means. Even at the worst of times, except perhaps in the Second World War, when you look at the International Army and Subhash Chandra Bose, otherwise, the major part of our struggle against British rule was peaceful. So there is no reason why we should advocate a violent movement for any other country, especially a friendly country like Tibet and the Tibetan people. And also knowing that violent freedom struggles often result in great damage. And in the modern world, I think we have reached a point where peaceful struggles are far more effective than violent ones. So it is much better for the people of Tibet to continue their struggle in a non-violent way. And that is where the international community should also step in to sustain and help this freedom struggle. There was the first part of the question which I'm missing, I'm forgetting.
It was not a question. It was a comment saying that knowledge on the subject of Tibet is meager. So
yes, I entirely agree with that. In fact, I've identified some of the points that I think require further research. As I said, I'm not, for example, a linguist. So when I read that Tibetan and Chinese belong to one family of languages called Sino-Tibetan family, I was a little astounded by this. And this comes not from a Tibetan or a Chinese source, but from the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Languages. So now it is for people who know Chinese and Tibetan to try and understand and explain what this means and whether Tibetan can actually be called whether there's a family of languages called Sino-Tibetan family of languages. Similarly, the kind of assistance that China got from the British during the period of the post after the Second Opium War, these are areas that need further research. Certainly, India's links with Tibet, historical links, need to be investigated further. I'll give you one simple example of that. When the Nalanda University was set on fire by invaders, many monks in Nalanda carried books of Sanskrit and Pali across the border into Tibet. And those books remained there until Rahul Sankrityayan, who's called Mahapandit Rahul Sankrityayan, he made several trips to Tibet and he got many of these volumes back to India and kept them here. And fortunately so, because during the Cultural Revolution, the Chinese came and destroyed a lot of the records in Tibet. So this kind of exchange of knowledge between India and Tibet, when the Tibetans translated Sanskrit and Pali texts into Tibetan language, that was one of the largest translations undertaken ever, even in that part until much later in the world. And the Tibetans then helped carry this knowledge over to Mongolia, to the Manchus. The Tibetans helped devise the script of the Mongols and the Manchus through their script, which is based on scripts in India. So you have all this knowledge that is there, that we have forgotten. And China is trying to rewrite history where everything is going to be changed. And very soon, if we don't counter this, we will have no knowledge left of our links with China, or for that matter, East Turkestan.
Rabi, next question, please.
Sure, ma'am. The next question is by Mr. Anurag. His question is that the question over Tibet also becomes the battle over Buddhist heritage between India and China. Should Tibetan historical linkages, and especially the Indian imprint on Tibetan language, culture, food, and religion?
Yes,
Some disturbance at your end. Sir, would you like me to repeat the question?
Yeah, please, that's much better. I got just of it, but not the full. Yeah.
So Anurag is basically saying that this is a question of a matter of heritage of Buddhism. And as you mentioned, that the new Chinese initiative posits Buddhism as coming from China to Tibet. While historically it has been Buddhists like Guru Padmasambhava and Atisha from Indian subcontinent who were instrumental in spreading Tantric Buddhism, the main form of Buddhism prevalent in Tibet. Hence, the question over Tibet also becomes a battle over Buddhist heritage between India and China. Shouldn't India start propagating and funding research on Indo-Tibetan historical linkages, especially the Indian imprint on Tibetan language, culture, food, and religion?
Well, I entirely agree with the second part of the question, which is that India should promote research in India-Tibet relations, both past and present. On the first part, yes, it's extremely important that we counter any disinformation on Buddhism. But Buddhism has now become a world religion. And there is no reason for us to claim exclusive ownership of it. If there are other people who have developed on it, built on it, well, good for Buddhism. After all, Buddhism was the first global religion and it emanated from India. It should be a matter of pride for us that other people have taken it and built upon it and developed it. But the historical facts about where Buddhism came to Tibet from, whether it come from China, did it come from India, those details should necessarily be studied. But again, it is the issue of Tibet's statehood is not necessarily linked only to Buddhism. If the Tibetans belong to another religion, or even if Buddhism came to Tibet from China, Tibet would still have the right to determine its own future. The Tibetan people would have that right. Two people in a country can have the same language, and yet they may not want to be together, and they may want to be separate countries. So the Tibetan struggle for statehood and sovereignty should not be confused with Buddhism coming, whether it came from India or from China, because that is the right that the people of Tibet have to decide their own future.
I think since there's a little bit of a disturbance at the ICS end, I better read out the questions. So there's another two questions actually from Rajkumar. One is, in case of a Taiwan-China crisis, should India take an overt role towards Taiwan's independence? Or should India continue to play a neutral role? And the second question is, should Tibetans go for next Dalai Lama after the demise of the current Dalai Lama, or discontinue the process of I assume they mean Rajkumar means reincarnation. Should continue the process of reincarnation and only go for Tibetan parliament in exile as process and body to solve the Tibet problem?
Taiwan question is a completely separate question. It doesn't necessarily relate to Tibet. As a matter of fact, the Chiang Kai-shek government, when it was in power as nationalist China in mainland China, it asserted that Tibet was a province of China. So both at that time there were two governments, Yuan Shikai and Chiang Kai-shek and Sun Yat-sen, and both asserted that Tibet was a part of China. Now, of course, Taiwan's stand is a little more nuanced. It accepts that the people of Tibet should have the right of self-determination. So that is an improvement. But I don't think we should link the two. Our policy towards Taiwan has its separate issue. I won't like to go into it. On the Dalai Lama's, I think the Dalai Lama has made it clear that he has transferred all his temporal, which means political powers, to the central Tibetan administration. So he retains only his status as a religious leader or a spiritual leader of Tibet. The question of his succession will also naturally be a question, actually be a religious question, and it should be handled entirely by his religious followers, that is his monastery. And for a country like India, which is a secular country, and we have any number of people, monasteries around in India, religious institutions which elect or select the different ways in which they do it, like the Shankaracharyas, but the government of India doesn't interfere in those processes. So there's no reason why government of India should interfere in the process of the Dalai Lama, whether he wants to be incarnated or doesn't want to be incarnated, does he want to put an end to his institution? These are all religious questions, I think, in which the Indian government certainly should not get involved. People who are his followers, it is their job to look into it and decide.
Aditya, did you have a question? Aditya Sachin? Since we're waiting for more people to... Okay, here is a question from Aditya. As we saw, China is using its soft foreign policy, like Global Times, and funding to NGOs and organizations to hide its human rights situations in Tibet. So why India is not using same soft tactics to make a global view?
That is a very good question and a difficult question to answer. And one has to answer it only in the context of India's overall policy on human rights. Earlier this year in January, China's Universal Periodic Review, which is a 4-yearly review of a country's human rights situation, came up in the Human Rights Council. And in this process, various countries, in fact, all countries can make comments on the human rights situation in the country under review. 24 countries mentioned Tibet by name in their responses. India did not. India did not only not mention Tibet, it did not even raise any human rights concern in Tibet. Because India's policy is a policy where it says that human rights remains an internal matter of a country, and other countries can only help it strengthen its human rights situation. They should not interfere in that process. Now, this comes from a lot of other complex issues that we all are familiar with. So I don't think India is likely to change that policy of its in the near future. But I think there is scope here for strengthening our statements, our stand on the human rights situation. One of the problems that we face is that we do many good things, but we don't take credit for it because we are scared of putting it in law. An example of it is the asylum law. We don't have an asylum act in our country. And yet we have given asylum to so many people, the Dalai Lama down to Sheikh Hasina. And yet we don't have a procedure for giving asylum. And in international organizations, we cut a sorry figure because we're not able to say what our asylum policy is. Even on the principle of non-refoulement, which is sending a person back if he comes to your border. Now, we have never sent anybody back, but we have never formally said we abide by non-refoulement. Now, European countries are right now dumping people into the sea, pulling up barriers, and yet they claim that they have signed on to non-refoulement and they have asylum laws. And here you have a situation where UK now says that Sheikh Hasina should first apply and then we will see. And whereas we, in a matter of 45 minutes or maybe even less than 10 minutes, I believe, gave her asylum. But we have not given asylum formally. We have only said, okay, you can come in, because we don't have an asylum act. So it's one of those problems that we face. That's a separate issue altogether. But it's linked slightly to the Tibetan issue because you've done a lot of research in this, that everything is ad hoc when a refugee comes into the country. And there are no laws, there are no decisions recently in the northeast when Myanmar people, the um, the Chins came across. Again, we didn't know what to do. Rohingyas came, we didn't know what to do. So everything is then becomes a political issue and a decision is taken. So this is the same issue with human rights, where we are very strong on human rights, and yet we are not able to assert a policy which is a defined policy which one can articulate.
That was a very enlightening response, and I'd like a follow-up question later if we have time. But there are other questions now I need to get to as chair. So there's a question from Ritika Patil regarding ethics and international relations. Ritika says, with respect to China's assertive political behavior, to what extent are China's expansionist policies through historical claims justifiable?
Well, international law is fairly close to Jungle Raj, as we all know. Even Jungle Raj has certain rules. A lion attacks only when it is hungry. But in international relations, a country that asserts itself strongly gets what it wants. And this is the problem here with China. China has asserted its authority and insists that any country that does not accept its position cannot have diplomatic relations or will suffer all kinds of consequences, which is slightly different from our position. Now, our position on J&K is that J&K is our territory, and yet when countries say it is disputed, we protest, but we don't take any further action on that. Whereas China, for example, has successfully managed to make Arunachal Pradesh a disputed territory. If you look at maps of the UN, you can see that two parts of India, Jammu and Kashmir, Ladakh, and Arunachal Pradesh, are shown as distinct territories, which means now J&K, of course, is an international, there's some historical background to it, but Arunachal is only solely between China and India, and it's completely within Indian administration. There is a legal basis to that in terms of the McMahon line. But because of China's assertions and its position as a permanent member of the Security Council, it has been able to get it at least noted or quietly put in the maps of the UN as disputed territory. So that is how things are at the moment until ethics becomes a little more effective in international relations. But one can say that in the modern world, a certain amount of ethical principles do come in and they do play a role. You can see that in the case of some countries like Israel, for example, the kind of criticism that Israel is facing, despite the fact that it faced a terrorist attack in itself. So it may not be able to change the situation, the ground situation, but it certainly international public opinion does get affected and moved by ethical considerations.
There's a question on the Tibetan government in exile's position on Arunachal and Tawang. Anurag wants to ask that, as Sering Shaki had mentioned in his work, The Dragon in the Land of the Snow, the current areas of dispute between PRC and India were actually those between India and Tibet, like you said, you also just mentioned. And for example, for instance, till 1947, the Dalai Lama's government sent tax collectors to Tawang until it was recovered by India in the immediate aftermath. So what is the current position of the Tibetan government in exile, which now, of course, we call the CTA, on Arunachal and Tawang?
Well, frankly, I don't know the answer to this question. It'll have to be put to somebody there. But what I can say is this. In 1947, when India became independent, one of the first communications that came from the Tibetan government, it didn't come to India, it went to England, saying that the territories that Britain had taken away from Tibet and merged into British India should be returned. And that was one of the reasons why I think a certain amount of sympathy was lost by Tibet in its relations with India. At present, we have had no official discussions with the Central Tibetan administration on the border between India and Tibet. So there's no reason for the Central Tibetan administration to expound its position. There are reports that they are preparing a map of Tibet, which may be released soon. One presumes that when this map is released, they will respect India's territorial integrity, at least whatever territory India claims as part of India. Because if they were to question that, then that would mean further trouble for them. So I hope that that does not become the case. And that I personally believe that we should actually open dialogue with the CTA on the border issue, so that if and when this matter comes up later, then at least we have some basis for where the border is, and there is some degree of mutual understanding of that.
Just to follow up on this question, do you think as a policy option, a discussion on the border with the CTA is something that India can explore publicly?
Impossible. Impossible. We don't even recognize it as a government in exile. It is registered as a non-government organization, as an NGO. So it has all the trappings of a government in exile, and yet it's a non-government organization.
But one would have hold some kind of a seminar or something to discuss about the India-Tibet border, because increasingly one is getting to hear this. This is not the India-China border. This is the India-Tibet border.
So I think that is where I hope organizations like the ICS and other bodies which hold such discussions can organize a discussion on this, invite some scholars across from Dharamshala or even Tibetans abroad, and have a discussion on this to see what their thinking is. The Tibetan CTA itself is in some difficulty because of all kinds of internal problems, but there are two things that need to be done right now, and one of them is that, you see, with the Dalai Lama aging and the possibility of his passing away looming on the horizon, and then the traditional problem of the interregnum coming between one Dalai Lama and the other, and given the fact that the present Dalai Lama is such a towering spiritual figure that no other Tibetan is a known figure today. So what is needed is perhaps for countries to promote at least the identity of some of the people in the CTA, so that their stature grows enough for them to be able to claim leadership of the Tibetan community and the Tibetan movement as and when the time arises. And this can be done through organizations, academic organizations like the ICS, and also, sadly, in India, members of parliament are not very active in this.
Yeah.
Members of parliament can certainly play a role in this. They are not government people. Just the way in the US, they use the Congress as an instrument of foreign policy, and you have case of this act that the US has passed. The Congress passes an act which the president signs, and then he negates it by making a statement. So now, obviously, the act is an act which has been signed by the president, but his policy, which takes decisions today. Tomorrow, if the US wants, it can easily go back and say, look, we have an act and we have recognized it.
There's a general question on human rights, not related to the topic of the talk. So if you could just briefly address it. Human rights, this is from Vijay Thakur. Human rights being only an emotional issue and lip service, I suppose, lip service for the whole world. Ultimately, it's economic strength that really matters. What is your comment?
Yes and no. Human rights is one of the very new areas in international relations that is getting prominence. And the UN, where the human rights issue comes up, itself recognizes that human rights is an internal matter of a country. And yet, given the world in which we are, this globalized world where people are traveling all around, human rights is an important fact. If an Indian travels abroad and faces a problem, then Government of India will intervene. Similarly, if an Indian's relative who's a national of another country gets into trouble, then again, governments will take up the matter. And while it is true that countries will clamp down on any kind of discussion on human rights, The fact is that in the Human Rights Council, every country has gone through the Universal Periodic Review every 4 years, including Israel. Israel had boycotted once, and then it went back to it. So people, their international image does matter to the government. And the number of all countries take their representation in the Human Rights Council very seriously. So obviously, they are aware of the fact that even though it may not have any legal implication, the overall impact of the discussions and the public mind does carry a certain amount of weight. That's what we have to build on to promote a better world with more greater respect for human rights.
While we wait for more questions, I'd like to get one in. This is specifically related to the first part of your talk. Do you think historically we can locate the application of suzerainty over Tibet, Chinese suzerainty over Tibet, to the 1907 Anglo-Russian Pact? Or do you think it precedes that?
Well, the first document where the word suzerainty is included is in the document that was signed 1 year before that in 1906
the trade
between Britain and China. No, this was the agreement. You see, I mentioned, let me give the sequence of events. 1890, Britain and China sign an agreement defining the border between Sikkim and Tibet. 1893, they sign the regulations under this border agreement, under which British tea and other goods were allowed to go into Tibet free of duty. And there was an agreement that they would set up border pillars demarcating the border. The Tibetans refused to accept this agreement. And when British officers would go and try and set up pillars, the border pillars, the Tibetans would come and throw them away. The Tibetans would not allow British Indian tea to enter Tibet. So Britain was very frustrated, and it tried through the Chinese to compel the Tibetans to accept the agreement. The Tibetans refused. In 1899 came, 9 years later came Curzon, George Nathaniel Curzon, as the Governor General. Now Curzon was an imperious figure, and he wrote to London. He wrote a letter to the Dalai Lama soon after coming here, saying, Dalai Lama, this is an agreement we've signed with China, you please honor it. That letter went to the Tibetan official. It was delivered to a Tibetan official on the border. The Tibetan official kept the letter. After 6 months, he sent it back to Kolkata, unopened. Now, this made Curzon furious. He said, how can there be a country within a few hundred kilometers of the British capital, Kolkata, which is not even prepared to open a letter? It's not even prepared to recognize that the great British emperor is not even being recognized by the Tibetans and be treated so callously. So he insisted that Britain must enter Tibet to enforce the agreement, which is on the trade and the border. Britain refused to let him enter. It finally said, okay, you can go just across the border and try and enforce it somehow over there. Then two Indian traders were killed, presumably by Tibetans somewhere. So Curzon said, now this is it's an act of war. The Tibetans have killed 2 British subjects, and we will invade. And he practically forced London to permit him to go to Lhasa. When British troops reached Lhasa, young husband was called from, he was in Indore, I think, as resident. He was called back from there, and they invaded. They reached Lhasa. When they reached Lhasa, the 13th Dalai Lama fled to Mongolia. And the 3 monastery heads there, they were forced to sign an agreement, which young husband dictated. Under the agreement, they had to pay a fine of, I think, 75 million rupees. And Chumbi Valley would be occupied by Curzon, by the British, until the money was paid. In fact, Curzon wanted to occupy Chumbi Valley even before. He said that Chumbi Valley is actually south of the watershed. It is not north of the watershed, so it doesn't belong to Tibet anyway. But Britain never accepted that line of argument. So young husband's treaty was signed, but the Russians were very angry with this. And the British realized that they would have to do something to bring China into the picture again. And that is when they asked China to send a representative to Kolkata, and a representative came down. Incidentally, the representative's advisor was an Englishman, a chap called James Hart. So the Chinese ambassador came down from Beijing and along with a British advisor, and they came and they signed this agreement of 1906, in which China again agreed that yes, trade etc. would be there, and here for the first time a sentence was put in that Tibet was under Chinese suzerainty. And then this phrase was used again in the 1907 agreement that Britain signed with Russia.
And this in your archival explorations, you have never seen any adjustment on the issue of suzerainty by British India, or when transfer of power was happening to independent India?
No, when India became independent, Britain wrote to the Dalai Lama saying that we are moving out of India and we would like you to recognize the government of India as the successor state. And it was in response to this letter that the Tibetan government, the Dalai Lama was very young at that time, the Tibetan government wrote back saying, you are leaving, why don't you give back the territory that you had taken from us?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that's how the thing began. And then Tibet wanted to send a trade delegation to India and to the US and Britain.
Yes, UK.
But when they came to India, India said, we can't talk to you because you don't recognize us.
Yeah.
So the delegation then moved on to the US, etc. When it came back, by that time, Tibet had recognized the government of India as a successor state. And then trade talks started. And
hence, I think the neighbor that India lost.
Hence the neighbor that India lost. Because I think that at that time, the Tibet's obduracy was rather short-sighted. And as it is, I don't think our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, had any sympathy for religious mumbo-jumbo. And the theocracy was not the kind of thing that would appeal to him. So all these factors, I think, determined our policy.
Are there any other questions? There's a question that Anurag would like to ask about any scholarly material that you could point to regarding the 1687 skirmish between Tibet and Mughal Empire.
I don't have much evidence. I didn't go to the papers of that. This I have got through secondary sources that there was the Mughal army that invaded. And actually, there was some problem that Ladakh was under invasion from Tibet and it appealed for help. And that's how the Mughal army then moved in. But the Mughals controlled Kashmir for a long time, but they had not moved into Ladakh. And they moved into Ladakh after that. They helped out. But of course, they didn't stay back in Ladakh. Ladakh was eventually merged in Jammu Kashmir in 1834 by Gulab Singh, who had taken over as the Maharaja of Jammu Kashmir.
Any other questions? Would anybody like to weigh in? Okay, there's a question by Seringbu. He says, you rightly mentioned about the shifting narratives amongst Chinese scholars about when Tibet became part of China. Professor Elliot Sperling has discussed some aspects of this. Could you please share your perspectives from your reading of the archives?
Yes, it's interesting to see how China viewed Tibet. Now, in the first occupation of Tibet by a foreign force was by the Mongols. This was in 1250. This was the grandson of Genghis Khan, Gadan Khan, who invaded Tibet and conquered it. Thereafter, when Kublai Khan took over the eastern part of the empire, after Genghis Khan, the Mughal empire was divided into 4 parts, and the easternmost part went to Kublai Khan. And Kublai Khan ruled Tibet from Beijing. But it was clear that Tibet was a part of the Mongol Empire at that time. Of course, the Chinese claimed that Kublai Khan was Chinese, as was Genghis Khan. So that's a different rewriting of history. Now, the Mings, when they overthrew the Mongols, the Ming dynasty, which was the Han Chinese dynasty, they had 11 provinces in their empire. Tibet was not one of them. The Mings did not have any representative in Lhasa. There was no Chinese force in Lhasa. But yes, lamas from Tibet used to go to China, and they were patronized by some Ming rulers also. And they would get gifts and come back. This was the priest-patron relationship that continued even after the Mongols were overthrown from China. When the Manchus took over, the Manchus again valued Tibet because Tibetans were the educated people in this region. Tibetans had these scriptures, the Buddhist texts, and they had the script. They had the knowledge of how to run an administration. So the Kangxi emperor, who was the second Manchu emperor of the Qing dynasty, he invited the fifth Dalai Lama to come to Beijing. He had a palace built in his honor. And the fifth Dalai Lama stayed in Beijing, and he helped the Kangxi emperor. So the Manchus used Tibetan philosophy, Tibetan knowledge, Tibetan religion to raise their own stature and their claim to be a major imperial power of the region, and to claim the loyalty not only of the other Manchus but also of the Mongols. But the Manchus also, they had 18 provinces in their empire. Tibet was not one of the empires, was not one of the provinces of China. So, and even today, Tibet is still listed as an autonomous region, the so-called Tibetan autonomous region. So the Chinese, as Sperling himself has brought out, and here I depended upon Sperling and his analysis, that because I have no access to how Chinese look at it, but I have seen some of the Chinese books. That one book said that in 1793, now 1793 is the rule of Qianlong Emperor. Qianlong Emperor had sent an army across to Tibet to drive out the Nepalese or the Gurkhas from Shigatse. And after this, the army came to Lhasa. The Qianlong Emperor issued an instruction, it was called some articles reorganizing the administration of Tibet. So I've read one Chinese historian who says that from this day, that is 1793, Tibet became a part of China. Then some say no, the Tibet became a part of China in 1720, when the first Amban was appointed by the Manchu ruler and stationed in Lhasa. So you have 1720, 1793, and then you have, of course, people talk about the Mongols, then people talk about the ancient times. But in my opinion, actual Chinese rule in Tibet starts only when the first Han Chinese was appointed as the Amban in Lhasa. When the Manchus were ruling, it was only towards the very fag end of their rule that they started appointing Han Chinese as Ambans. Till the beginning of the 20th century, there was no Han Chinese who had been appointed as Amban in Lhasa. It was always a Manchu. So they maintained that distinction, that Tibet was not part of China, and it was ruled directly by a Manchu appointed by the emperor. And it was only around 1906 or so that I think the first, again, here is something I'd like people to, scholars to do research and find out. When was the first Han Chinese Amban appointed in Lhasa? We all know about Chao Er-feng. Chao Er-feng was the governor of the marches of Sichuan, and he was also appointed concurrently as Amban to Lhasa in 1910. And he is famously known as the Butcher of Lhasa because of his atrocities in Lhasa. And he was eventually killed. Now, one of the points that I realized was that the Chinese were able to assert their authority as the Han Chinese in Lhasa only after the Dalai Lama had fled. In 1904, when young husband invaded Lhasa, the 13th Dalai Lama fled. And this enabled China to take full control and start running the place as if it was Chinese territory. So till then, the Dalai Lama enjoyed almost complete autonomy, except for the presence of the Amban, who was more like a friend, advisor, whatever you want to call him. So it is a very controversial point that requires greater study to understand how China looks at Tibet and how Tibet looks at China, and how differently they perceive each other and how they perceive themselves vis-a-vis the other country.
Thank you for that comprehensive response, Ambassador Sinha. I'm afraid we are at the end of our time, but it has been a very fruitful discussion to point out, especially, what you said can be forward-looking research on Tibet and India that I think all of us are invested in and should be invested in. I would like to thank Ambassador Sinha for a very engaging and a very forthcoming session on a book which I think many of us would be very interested in reading and will benefit from, especially in terms of what is offered as an argument on Tibet and whether we have different views on that. Thank you so much, Ambassador Sinha, and thank you, ICS, for organizing this.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you, Sonika. Thank you, Ambassador Sinha. I must say that your suggestion that platforms like the ICS should be really the basis for taking on discussions which can best be comprehensively laid out at the scholarly level before we sort of move on. I mean, I think the need of the hour is dire. Scholars must debate all sorts of positions, possibilities. That's how really the way forward emerges. So that's a good suggestion, and we shall try to take them up. But thank you very much. This has been a really fascinating talk, and thanks, Sonika, for some very interesting side questions that you made, spiced up the discussion a bit. And thank you all for a very, very good set of questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Dr. Gupta, may I now ask your permission to formally bring an end to today's proceedings?
Yes, Gargi.
With this, we come to the end of today's seminar. We thank Ambassador Dilip Sinha and Dr. Sonika Gupta for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also offer our gratitude to the audience. The video of today's discussion shall be available on the ICS's YouTube channel. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar scheduled for August 14th, 2024, titled Hobson's Choice, the US and China After the Next Election. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you all for joining us.